Codependency is defined as the excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner, while Blue Lock is a manga/anime about a teenage boy entering into a football program so he can become the best striker in the world. On the surface, these two things should have no commonality, but I would argue that one of the main themes and lessons that Blue Lock has continuously taught since the beginning of its story is how being codependent on another person is not good, and even shows various stages of how unhealthy it could get. So I thought it'd be interesting to finally do this video and use 3 dynamics we see in the Blue Lock story as examples. But before we get into that, my name is Serena and I love yapping about Blue Lock. So if you also enjoy Blue Lock, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing. My next goal for this channel is 2K subscribers, so anything and everything would help a lot. So like I said, codependency has been a theme since the beginning of the Blue Lock story. If you look at most of our main characters, they're linked to another character in some type of capacity. So there are several examples that I could dive into to talk about this topic, but in the case of this video, like I said, I'll narrow it down to just 3 relationships that I think best represent specifically the toxic side of codependency. Since I just want to make it clear, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to want to rely on the people around you. In fact, it's healthy to realize that sometimes you can't do everything on your own and will need to lean on the people around you. Since, well, yes, Blue Lock teaches you to be an egoist that wants to become the best striker in the world that constantly seeks their own goals, football itself is inherently a team sport, and even to be the best in the world, you would still need support. Since Blue Lock denounces the extreme opposite of codependency as well, which is solely relying on yourself and never putting your trust in others. And I would say the best example of that case would be Baru in the second selection, where he was very dependent on himself and wanting to be king, that it made him selfless in a toxic way that made it basically impossible to actually play with him. So all of this is to say, I just think you need to find a good balance between the two, since if you don't, then you could end up like some of the dynamics that I will discuss in this video. So I will be giving 3 examples that I think fits this theme. The first one being a codependent relationship that turned healthy, which would be Bachira and Isagi, and next we have a codependent relationship that's somewhat in the middle of the toxicity scale, which would be Reo and Nagi, and then we have a relationship that's extremely toxic and extremely codependent in the worst way possible, which would be Kaiser and Ness. So we'll basically be going from good to bad in the toxicity scale. So let's start with the first dynamic that we essentially got the full arc of, which is Isagi and Bachira. So back in the first selection, we see how quickly the two of them connect as friends, since Isagi for sure was at his weakest in terms of strength in the first selection. Not essentially a bad player like some people in both the manga and real life like to say, but he was clearly lacking one of the biggest things that you need in Blue Lock, which is confidence. We see it multiple times in matches during the first selection that every time Isagi had his back against the wall, he would begin to question his own skills, with the opposing team often egging him on as well. Probably the biggest example we saw of this was during the game against Team B when they were down 3 points and all felt hopeless except for Bachira. At Isagi's lowest moment in the manga so far, it was Bachira's confidence and skills that made Isagi get out of that slump and change his outlook going forward. And the moment we see Isagi lose Bachira in the second selection during the 3v3, he reverts back to himself from the first selection, feeling hopeless, and it only hits him that he's become so dependent on both Bachira's skills and positive attitude when Nagi calls him out for this. But that only comes after Isagi himself calls out Nagi's reliance on Reo, which we will talk more about later. It is at this point we see Isagi take a healthy step where he realizes that if he doesn't fight for himself, he will lose and be kicked out of Blue Lock. And it's through this fear and acknowledgement that we see him begin to have a real change of attitude, going from feeling like he needs to have someone to do well to directly challenging top players in his building like Baru head on without fear, which much more aligns with the main character that we know from the NAL and now the World Cup. But we only got to see this growth in Isagi once Bachira was forcibly removed from him, since it forced him to have to develop knowing that it was his only chance of survival. And it's quite interesting since while Isagi in a way is portrayed as the more attached one at first, first, we do see that Bachira is also attached to him in an unhealthy way. It's just in a different way, since we learn that Izaki is Bachira's first real friend, and we see the fear that if he's no longer of an interest to Izaki, like being a good player for his team, then he will lose him not only as a teammate but as a friend, which is an unhealthy way of thinking, since Bachira thinks that the only value he has to Izaki and the only reason why he wants him around is because he's a valuable player, and not thinking that maybe Izaki could see him as a genuine friend. Since we also see that Bachira ties so much of the Blue Lock experience to Izaki, so if he loses him, then he essentially not only loses having a friend, but he'll also no longer be at Blue Lock, where he's made many new friends now. So similar to Izaki, Bachira views not being able to play football with him as not being able to move forward, and he doesn't think that he could fight for himself. But I would call his dependence on Izaki even more unhealthy, since we never see Izaki question his future friendship with Bachira, just fearing that losing him means that he can't survive in Blue Lock. Before Bachira, Izaki represents everything that Bachira has been missing in his life, and he fears that he'll go back to those feelings of loneliness without him. So there are clearly two people who are extremely dependent on the other, and while Izaki through the second selection has better found himself and was able to break through his fears to play at a higher level, we see that Bachira is now the one struggling, and his fears are making him play significantly worse. But he does eventually have a breakthrough where he realizes that he's playing football for the wrong reasons now, and that he's playing because of his fears that if he doesn't do a good job, then he'll end up alone, and that his very reason for existing has become to play with Izaki. And before some people say that I am over exaggerating, these are the exact words that came from Bachira. So when I say that there is a level of unhealthiness and even toxicity for our upcoming dynamic, it's because it's clearly either told to us or shown to us in the manga. Like, the author isn't even being subtle with this theme, especially when it came to Izaki and Bachira. But going back to the second selection, while we do see Bachira have this realization, he does go to the other side of the extreme, which is feeling like he has to completely reject everyone around him, including his monster that has been a big part of the way he's been playing football, believing that being alone is what's best for him to grow. And he goes for a goal, but it gets blocked. And I believe the reason for this is that Bachira got the wrong idea of what he needed to do. He realized that he was being too dependent on others and thought that meant he had to cut out everyone around him. But like I said, that is just another unhealthy way of thinking, since Bachira has felt the crushing weight of loneliness, and that isn't what he needed to go back to. So that's why I think he failed. Since yes, he did fail because Izaki was able to block his goal, but on a deeper level, I believe the author wanted to show that Bachira's mindset was still not on the correct path. But still, we see Bachira and Izaki reunite on the same team, but both in a much healthier place than they were before, finally realizing that they do want to play football together still, but they needed to fight on their own first to finally find a healthy balance. Since from this point forward, Bachira and Izaki might not have as many moments together in their friendship, but we can see the admiration and respect they still have for each other, constantly meeting again on the field, whether it's on different teams like the NEL or on the same team like the U20 World Cup. But there's no longer this dependence on the other, but a mutual understanding to push each other to be the best on the world stage. And that's the conclusion to the healthiest version of this topic. I truly do believe it was intentional on the author's part to not only show Bachira and Izaki's unhealthy codependence on each other first, but also show us a full arc and the journey of it and not dragging it out, since he wanted to show a healthy version of a friendship and what it looks like between two players. Since while this arc is happening, we're also getting our next discussed dynamic, which is Reo and Nagi, that was happening at the same time. And you could definitely see the difference between the journey of these two dynamics. Now, when you think of a toxic and unhealthy codependence in Blue Lock, most people would probably think of Reo and Nagi first, since in my opinion, they're not even the most toxic one in the story. We'll get to them soon, but they are the one that we get the most dedicated time to in the story. Since the beginning of their introduction, there was clearly an imbalance in their friendship, with Reo essentially doing everything for Nagi, from giving him passes, feeding him, and even carrying him around because Nagi was too lazy to walk. It honestly made you wonder why Reo even put up with Nagi, but you soon realize that the benefit that Reo got out of his friendship was that he believes to win the World Cup he needs Nagi. So it's already established that Reo is putting an unrealistic expectation on Nagi, since it's one thing to have this goal for himself, but making himself believes that he needs Nagi to achieve that goal is just setting up their relationship for failure, since Nagi was never going to meet such a high expectation. And this is just made worse in the episode Nagi spinoff, since we see Reo sacrificing himself and his dreams to make Nagi the best in the world, saying that's his new ego, which you probably didn't need me telling you this, but yes, this is a very unhealthy way of thinking. Reo parallels Bachira in a way of thinking, which is revolving so much of his existence around another person, but unlike Bachira, we haven't seen Reo come out the other side of this dynamic with a healthier understanding. So let's talk about it. So obviously, the first time that we truly get to see the toxicity between these two is during the beginning of the second selection, when Nagi decides to not team up with Reo. Now, it's obviously not a great friend move that Nagi decided to not team up with Reo after everything he's done for him, but Blue Lock, at least at the beginning, was a competition, and Nagi genuinely thought that he could grow more teaming up with Isagi, which was true, since Isagi challenges Nagi and doesn't give everything to him like Reo does, since Reo does it because he cares about Nagi and wants to make his life easier for him. But as we see later on in the story, that was just stunting Nagi's growth and doesn't help him. So Nagi was making the right choice here, since he knows the easier path is with Reo. And this is a small moment in the spin-off, but we actually see that Nagi is the one that asks Reo to promise to stay with him until the end and not the other way around. So Nagi did have plans to stay with Reo, and he wasn't just immediately dumping him because of the next best thing. But in that moment, we see growth in Nagi, realizing that if he truly does want to be the best, then he can't just entirely rely on Reo. So that being said, I do see both sides here, since I mainly see people being upset with Reo's reaction in this moment, but I think it's also important to put into perspective that Reo isn't just viewing this as, for example, a friend choosing another friend group in gym class, but as complete abandonment from Nagi. Since remember, Reo's ego at this point was fueled and revolved around Nagi. So separation feels much more extreme to him, because at this point, Reo's codependency is worse and he wasn't ready to fight individually. So he felt even more hurt by Nagi's actions. And after, we do see Reo acknowledge that he should have had a better reaction to seeing Nagi grow and let him go, because he knows that they would reunite again in the future, but he couldn't do that because he feared that Nagi would never come back, which is a toxic way to think, since it's natural and healthy that sometimes the people in your life will have to go on their own paths without you, and if they're truly someone that was meant to be in your life, then you have to trust that they will come back. I think it's also important that we tie this way of thinking to how Reo was raised, since he himself says that he's used to getting everything that he wants in life, and that Nagi is the first thing that Reo hasn't been able to have. So yes, once again, I'm not exaggerating, these are the exact words in the manga, but this does give us another good insight into Reo's mind, since at this point, he's also seeing Nagi as an object that he discovered, and therefore quote-unquote owns him. And I'm not trying to say that Reo is doing this on purpose or that he doesn't care about Nagi, but Reo has grown up in a very materialistic world where he gets whatever he wants, and he felt like Nagi was his. So it gives you an even deeper understanding into where Reo's codependency and toxic way of thinking comes from. So knowing that this type of behavior is more tied into Reo's character, it does also explain why he would struggle to have a faster growth and healthier understanding of relationships in comparison to like Bachira did, since we see Reo multiple times acknowledge that he is aware that he needs to grow and do better, and even hates himself that he can't change as fast as he's seeing his peers change, but going back to the same behavior, like begging Nagi to choose him after his team loses the 3v3, even though he knows deep down that he shouldn't do that. We do see that Reo probably probably at this point was at the height of his toxicity, just on a path of self-destruction and self-hatred, where the only thing he felt like he could do in that moment was just push Nagi farther away because he can't make a healthier decision in that moment, and thinks that just having Nagi hate him is the right thing to do in that moment. And before people think that I'm just putting all the blame on Reo for the toxicity of their relationship, we might see Reo's worst moments in the second selection in terms of the codependence and reliance on Nagi, but it's not just him, since later on we would see Nagi's worst moment in the NEL, and this was probably the moment where I saw a lot of people turn on the Nagi and Reo dynamic, since after the second selection we do actually see both Reo and Nagi go on their own paths, since they do have moments such as Reo choosing Nagi's team in the third selection and then Nagi attaching himself to other characters such as Isagi, but it definitely wasn't as bad as when he was with Reo. So overall, both would have real moments of growth and showing they could fight individually throughout the manga, but this would all come to head in the Manchild versus Bastard match in the NEL, and would show Nagi's extreme codependency and toxicity by wanting to team up with Reo again because it's the easier way out. And I mean, we even see Reo call out Nagi for what he's doing in this moment, not caring about how Reo would feel, since he knows that Reo is trying to do better and get stronger on his own, but by Nagi saying that he needs him, that would destroy the progress that Reo has worked so hard to build up. And that's exactly what happens, since Reo even calls Nagi a selfish jerk, but goes to him because Nagi asked him to, and I've seen a lot of people mad about this moment, myself included, since I know it might not seem that way by everything I've said in this video, but Reo and Nagi are some of my favorite characters, and this moment was painful because it's like watching a slow train wreck and knowing there's nothing you could do to stop it. But I've seen the reason why a lot of people got mad over this moment is because it undoes all the progress that both of these characters have made, and because of that I've seen a lot of people call it a bad writing moment, and while yes, I do agree that it does undo all the progress that Nagi and Reo made up to this point, I wouldn't classify it as a bad writing moment since it is a realistic look at relationships. Codependency isn't a linear line, it's going to have its ups and downs, and not all dynamics are going to look like Isagi and Bachira's, where they're going to be able to get to that healthy place after hitting their rock bottom. A lot of these dynamics are going to look like Reo and Nagi's, where you go through this cycle over and over again and make a lot of the same mistakes. So if it felt frustrating to watch, that's because it's supposed to be. These characters are codependent to an unhealthy point where it's toxic. And it only took Nagi saying that he needed Reo for him to fold faster than a folding chair and go back to his old way of revolving his world to Nagi and throwing out his own dreams and progress to help him. So of course, to no one's surprise, this doesn't go well, and it's definitely this moment that sealed Nagi's faith and led to his elimination, since he attempts to let go of Reo in the last game against Bachira, but at this point it's too late. Of course, these actions are hurtful to Reo as well, since it was Nagi that asked Reo to return to his side, only for him to throw him away again. And yes, I do say throw away, since the issue has never been that Reo and Nagi can't play together. Clearly they are strong together as they're both amazing players. It's just the over-reliance on each other where it's almost like no one else exists on the pitch, since they need to have a dynamic closer to Bachira and Isagi where they're able to play on the field as individuals but can come together when needed to support each other and also challenge the other to be better, as team players should be. But clearly, Reo and Nagi at this point in the story at least are far away from this point, since they aren't even currently talking to each other. And once again, we see Nagi try to rely on Reo, but Reo is the one that has actually put a hard boundary by blocking Nagi. And while there has been mixed feelings from people about this action from Reo, and while I have said that cutting people off completely usually isn't the answer, I do think with how codependent and toxic toxic that Nagi and Reo got, space is what is best for them at this moment. And of course, this isn't going to be the end of their story, since we do see that Nagi is going down a dark and villainous path, and I do think that Reo is going to play a large part in bringing Nagi back to a better path. But yeah, I have often seen people say how over dramatized Nagi and Reo's storyline is, and while they are fan favorite characters, I do often hear people say that their least favorite thing about each of their characters is this relationship. But I do hope seeing their relationship through this lens will give a better understanding of why the author is telling their story in this way. It's meant to be frustrating, imperfect, but I do believe that we will see Reo and Nagi get to a healthier place, since we have seen an example of the most unhealthy and toxic version of codependency in Blue Lock, and I don't believe that Reo and Nagi would get to this point, but let's discuss our next dynamic. So, where do I even begin with Ness and Kaiser? While they have the least amount of panel time of the other two dynamics I've discussed, and we've currently only seen them in one arc, oh boy, does it not give you a lack of things to talk about. Since while there is a mix of healthy and toxic moments in the other two dynamics, Ness and Kaiser are just purely toxic codependency, and it's definitely the author's way of showing what happens when this behavior goes unchecked. So to start, we meet Ness and Kaiser in the NEL arc, and it's pretty clear right off the bat what their dynamic is. Kaiser says and Ness does without question. You can immediately see that there's an imbalance in their friendship where they are not equals to each other. But we only get to see the true extent of how toxic and codependent they are as the arc goes on, but it's pretty clear even from the first chapter with these two that something isn't completely right. But by the first match with Bachira, we see Ness is loyal to Kaiser on an extreme level, and his goal is to make Kaiser the best striker in the world, which shows similarities to Reo, but like I said, Ness and Kaiser shows what Reo and Nagi's behavior could have been most likely if they had never failed in the NEL together. But we also see that dependence comes from Kaiser, since it might be easy to forget sometimes, but there was a point where Kaiser did rely on Ness, since Yoichi even makes a comment on this during the first match, saying how even he could make amazing goals if he had such amazing midfielder to back him up, showing that at least at some point, Ness was a large part of Kaiser's success. Since yes, Ness is the midfielder of the team, but it's pretty clearly established that Kaiser and Ness were a duo. And the first time we see the Kaiser impact, it's from a pass that Ness did, and it's probably the best we'd seen Ness play in the story, and it's directly through his actions that we see Kaiser's weapon, the fastest swing speed kick in the world, the Kaiser impact. So it's established pretty early on, at least in this point in the story, Kaiser and Ness did need each other. And it was also at this point in the story that while yes, Ness was probably a bit too loyal to Kaiser, since in return Kaiser wasn't the nicest to him, there was still this dynamic between them that just seemed like two players playing at a high level and supporting each other to get better. I would say we start to see the full extent of how unhealthy their relationship is after the Manshine match is over, since we did get to see hints after the Bachira match where Ness is very upset about Isagi stealing Kaiser's goal by giving an assist to Kunigami, and he tells him he should quit football over this, which is quite an extreme reaction since it's understandable he'd be slightly annoyed, but seeing him this upset mostly on the behalf of Kaiser farther shows that something isn't right. Plus, this is also the first time we would see Kaiser putting his hands on Ness, and it's more played off as a comedic moment here, but it's an indicator of just how bad their relationship is, that Kaiser feels comfortable enough to not just only do that, but also in front of cameras and his team, not caring or seeing an issue with how he's treating Ness, even calling him names while he's doing it. And we would see more examples of this throughout the arc. And by Ness's reaction, you could definitely tell that he's used to this. farther showing that this is a common and normal thing between them. Since we would see this happen again after the Manshine match, where Ness has another strong reaction to Isagi in his eyes disrespecting Kaiser by stealing goals from him, and we would see Kaiser once again putting his hands on Ness, but this time being even more aggressive, since this time we would see Ness's invisible pain, and only a few chapters later we would see more of the toxicity between the two of them, since we would see the two of them chatting about Isagi and what to do about him. During this scene, Ness is being very nice to Kaiser, bringing him his glasses and drinks, but in return, Kaiser throws a drink in Ness's face. And you would think Ness would get upset about this, since even if someone is your friend that you love and care about, you shouldn't accept disrespectful behavior like this from anyone, but especially someone that is your friend. But instead of getting upset, he just brushes it off like it's once again normal behavior for them, and we would only finally see him get upset, not over what Kaiser did, but instead getting upset that Kaiser is putting so much of his attention to someone else. If Ness had a healthy relationship with Kaiser, then he wouldn't be accepting this behavior from him and addressing it with him, but clearly you can see that Ness feels like he needs Kaiser to the point where he would accept anything from him, since Kaiser at this point has called him names, physically grabbed him multiple times, and even thrown things at him, but this has not once made Ness's loyalty or dedication waver. In fact, it would just get worse. But it wouldn't be until the Ubers match, and through that, we would finally get more insight into where Ness's dependence comes from, which is in chapter 242. I won't go in too much depth about Ness's backstory, since I actually did a whole video going into depth about it and analyzing it when it first came out. So if you want to check that out after, if you're interested, then please do. But basically, we see that as a child, Ness was neglected and not accepted by his family for being different, and Kaiser was the first person that we see helped him to feel seen and accepted by someone. So similar to Bachira with Isagi, Kaiser was Ness's first real friend, and similar to Reo with Nagi, we see that helping Kaiser is what fuels Ness's ego. So his dependence is like a combination of all the previous dynamics, and why he has such a strong reaction to feeling like Kaiser is pulling away from him is because it feels like abandonment. But the reason why I think it's even more extreme in Ness's case, since it's not necessarily we get as much internal dialogue like with other characters like Reo and Bachira, so that's why I more so have to guess and read between the lines with him. But I think that Ness also views Kaiser as his family, since we will get to Kaiser in a second, but it is made a point that both Ness and Kaiser don't really have a family, and we see characters like Reo and Bachira, while they do crave connections via friendships, they do have other people in their lives that could support them. So that's part of the reason why I feel like Ness and Kaiser's relationship has reached this level of toxicity, because as far as we know, they only really have each other in terms of emotional support and someone caring about them. But we've been speaking heavily about one side of this dynamic, and typically what we've seen in this video with the other dynamics is that it seems like one person is more attached than the other, but as time goes on, we see that the other person is either just as dependent in the relationship or even more so in some ways. But I feel like the interesting case with Kaiser when it comes to Ness is because as his obsession with Isagi grows, he pulls farther away from Ness. But we do see that there are shades of dependence on Kaiser's side, since at the beginning of their friendship, we do see that it was actually Kaiser that made an effort to connect with Ness. And at this point, they had a healthy relationship and dependence on each other, where they actually helped each other and supported each other. And now knowing Kaiser's past, when you look back at that chapter, this was probably Kaiser's first real healthy relationship. And I do think that while it's not stated in the manga, I do think Kaiser to an extent also viewed Ness as his family, since he also doesn't really have a support system. And in a way, Ness and Kaiser's dependence, while it's a combination of the others, it's also unique in the sense that trauma bonding is involved in their dependence for each other, which is what has made the transition from it being a healthy one to a toxic one. And the definition for trauma bonding, for those that might not know, or at least one definition that you can go by, it's a deep emotional connection that forms between a victim and their abuser through a cycle of abuse and positive reinforcement, leading to attachment and dependence on the abuser despite the harm they cause. Does that sound like any dynamics we might know? And since this is a bit of a heavier subject matter than the other dynamics we have discussed, there are a few things I want to make clear. This is all just speculation and analysis that I have done through reading this story. So if you view their dynamic differently, that's okay. And this is just one person's opinion. And two, I'm not saying that just because Ness and Kaiser come from broken homes, this is the path that they were always going to lead down. No, of course not. I would never say that. And at some point, there was a genuine pureness and healthiness in their friendship, but I think them just solely being the emotional support they had, even Ness saying that Kaiser's dream is now his dream, created a toxicity where Kaiser felt like he could treat Ness any way he wanted to, knowing that Ness wouldn't leave him because of the emotional connection and dependence he has on him, which has created this trauma bond they find themselves in. And you wouldn't see this anywhere more tested than the PXG versus Bastard match, the final match of the NEL arc, because oh boy, just when you thought these two couldn't get any more toxic, you get proven wrong. So as I've said, we have seen Kaiser slowly pulling away from Ness throughout the arc, especially once Kaiser got proven that he could fight on his own after his best goal we have seen so far in the series during the Ubers match without the help of Ness. But unlike Isagi that was making healthier decisions once he was able to get out of his dependent relationship with Bachira, Kaiser just got more toxic and unhealthy. Since, like I've been saying, the solution isn't just to cut people from your life, especially not the way that Kaiser attempted to do it. During the PXG match, we would see Kaiser's plays aren't going well, and he fears that he will lose everything if he doesn't beat Isagi, and he'll go back to his old life, which freaks him out. Ness attempts to calm down Kaiser, but it's not working, and Ness wants to prove that he is still useful to Kaiser by using the new weapon they had been practicing together. But it doesn't work out since Kiyora ends up assisting him, which just farther shows Kaiser he doesn't need Ness. And after this, we do see Kaiser openly acknowledge that Ness is a big part of why he's been able to get this far, but that he can't currently grow with the way things are with Ness. But once again, just fully cutting off Ness isn't the answer. And especially as his friend, of course Ness was going to feel hurt by this. And because Kaiser didn't go about resolving his dependence with Ness in a good way, we of course also see Ness spiral, making several attempts to get Kaiser's attention. And the fact that once Kaiser cut him off, he used words like king and master to describe himself to Ness just really shows how much Kaiser did not see him as equal to Ness if his actions weren't enough. And without Kaiser telling him what to do, Ness is essentially useless on the field, basically not able to function. And Kaiser decides to make it worse by telling Ness he should give up on football, which I'm sure after everything I've shown you, you understand why I consider Kaiser and Ness to be the most toxic dynamic on this list and in all of the manga. But this was the moment where Ness was at his lowest and Kaiser decided to still kick him while he was down. Someone that's basically his only family. So this should really seal the deal for you. And this actually could have been a really powerful moment where we see this be the moment where Ness gives up on Kaiser and decide that he has had enough and stand up for himself, since there are no excuses for treating someone that way. But Ness is just too broken at this point and he literally begs Kaiser. And some people might argue, well, isn't he at least doing something good by letting Ness go? But doing it this harshly by calling Ness a pig and talentless would just never be the way to go about things. Plus, it's not even like it's a healthy step for Kaiser either, since he's just leaving one dependent relationship for another, since he was chasing the high and the feelings of playing with Isagi, so it's not like he was truly taking steps so he could fight individually. And finally, it's only through losing to Isagi through Ness that we see Kaiser somewhat reflect on his treatment of Ness, but it's very centered around him and his anger at letting Isagi surpass him by having a better understanding of Ness than he could in that moment. Since Isagi even calls out how Kaiser writing off Ness is what made him lose, showing that wasn't the answer that he needed. And later on, as the arc is coming to an end, we see Kaiser asking why Ness is still following him after the horrible way he has treated him. And it's not like it's in an apologetic way, but just truly not understanding, saying that there's no way to repair things after everything. But Ness stays firm that he wants to stay by Kaiser's side, and at least for now, that's the end of the arc for these two, and we don't get a definitive conclusion on where they stand, but it seems they will continue with their toxic cycle and dependence on each other. So as we wrap up this video, we have seen a codependent relationship turn healthy. We have seen a codependent relationship that got so toxic that only true separation could begin to resolve it. And we've seen a codependent relationship that, at least at this point in the story, never found a true place of healthiness and is continuing down a toxic path. They all have similarities, but are also unique in their own ways of showing how out of control codependency can get when you don't have a healthy balance in your life. And hopefully I've shown you that the answer isn't just to be independent 100% of the time and would never rely on anyone, since the author has also shown multiple examples how that is just as toxic. But as I'm concluding this video, I hope I was able to explain this theme well and maybe shed some light on why these dynamics sometimes feel so intense, since if you view the story through this lens, it truly does give you a different perspective on these dynamics and not just feeling like things are dramatic for the sake of putting drama into the story without reason. Anyways, if you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. This is a different kind of video for me, which is also why it took a bit longer, since I had to research and reread a lot of chapters to really break down these dynamics. But it's been a video that I've wanted to do for a long time, since it's not the most happy subject, but it is an interesting one that heavily is evolved in the manga, and I just scratched the surface with it, since I briefly wanted to get into Isagi and Hiyori and how they were going down a similar path to Bachira and Isagi, but this video was already getting way too long and I really wanted to get it out for you guys, so please forgive me for the lack of uploads lately. I promise it will get better, but I want to put out quality videos as well, so I really hope you guys like this one, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!